Welcome to another session of the ISAF's Bookshelf series. It is a real pleasure to host Professor Patrick Olivelle for a conversation on his recent book, Ashoka, Portrait of a Philosopher King. Professor Patrick is one of the world's leading scholars of ancient India with an extraordinary body of work spanning Indian intellectual history, religion, law, and political thought. In this book, he offers a deeply engaging portrait of Ashoka, not simply as a Buddhist ruler or imperial conqueror, but as a complex and introspective figure whose inscriptions continue to shape how we think about kingship, morality, and governance in the ancient world. We're very fortunate to have him with us today, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much.
So my first question about the book is, one thing I was particularly curious about while reading your book was what led you to write it at this stage of your career. Given your long engagement with the history of ancient India, what was it that made you feel that this was the right moment to write a portrait of Ashoka? And what did you hope to contribute that earlier works had perhaps not fully captured?
Yeah, that's a long and interesting question. I have a short story answer and a long story answer. I'll give the short story first. In 2020, just before the start of COVID isolation for all of us, Dr. Ramachandra Guha sent an email to me asking me whether I would contribute a volume on Ashoka for his planned 40-volume series called Indian Lives, Biographies of Prominent Indians. I was a little hesitant at the beginning because I didn't consider myself at the time to be a quote Ashoka scholar. There were others who had done this. Professor Rabindranath Thapar had written a book on him. Professor Upinder Singh had worked on it. But finally, I said yes, because I was interested in the topic, because of the long story I'm about to tell you. I hope you don't mind.
Not at all.
So my history of engagement with Ashoka started with my history of engagement with this central concept of Indian civilization called Dharma, or in the Pali or Prakrit, Dhamma. It started around 1995, culminated in about 2000, when I edited and translated the 4 earliest texts on Dharma within the Brahmanical tradition called the Dharma Sutras. And my effort at that time to make a critical edition of the most important text of the Dharma Shastra tradition, that is the Manava Dharma Shastra, or the Code of Law of Manu. My interest in Dharma was because I wanted at that time, I was writing, editing books and translating works on Dharma, and I was asking, let me look at the history of this term. Quite frequently, we use words almost absent-mindedly, thinking that it has always been there. So I took a little time to look up this term. And the interesting fact that emerged was that it was not a central concept within the Brahmanical tradition. It was more significant in its absence than in its presence. It wasn't a central theological term, especially in the later Vedic tradition, the Upanishads, the Brahmanas, and later on the Shrauta Sutras, the Griya Sutras. So that was my initial, and then I got into Ashoka. I read his edicts because they were the earliest written documents of India. documents that we could locate in place and know the exact time when they were written. And we have them in exactly the same way that they were written because they were inscribed on stone, right? And in these brief 4,000 odd words, he uses the term dharma over 100 times. So that was my initial engagement with him. This work on Ashoka and that period made me think that the period between Ashoka and the Guptas, which I dubbed between the empires, between the two empires, was very seminal in the history of India. Many of the things that we take for granted of Indian civilization, for example, temples, for example, the very term dharma, various Buddhist institutions, Jain institutions, they all happened during this time. So I convened an international conference called Between the Empires around 2003, and the volume came out of that, was published in 2006, which in turn led me to look more closely at Ashoka and convene the international conference on Ashoka himself. It was in Delhi at the India International Center in 2009, and a volume of proceedings from that were published in 2012, both these volumes published by Oxford University Press. So that's my engagement with Ashoka. So when he asked me to write about Ashoka, I said, oh, well, I may have something to say. And so that was my long answer. You ask what I would contribute, something that was not there in other scholars who have studied Ashoka for the last, over 100 years, right? I think if I had written this book earlier in my career, now I'm 83 years old. I have been doing this for close to 50 years, right? If I had done it earlier, I would have produced a very different book. Probably not as good. Probably as a young scholar, you always look over your shoulder, second guessing yourself, thinking, what will my colleagues say? I'm too old for that. So I could just write a book and say, to hell with them, right?
And just focus on what you had to
and
say.
focus on what I have to say, right? And so that was, I think, in that sense, a book. And why it is different is that most of the books that were written on Ashoka, even by very prominent scholars, always included Buddhist hagiographical, mythical accounts of Ashoka, along with what is found in the inscriptions. And often the writer cannot take one out of the other. They are woven together. And I thought, I want to write a history of Ashoka purely from his own words, which we have, which is quite unique in Indian history, because we don't have the words of an emperor or a king, or even of a religious figure like the Buddha. They are all provided through the lenses given by later people. Right? Here we have that. So I thought I will write about him using his own words. And that's, I think, what is different from what I do from others. And I'll later talk about the pluses of this as well as the minuses. Because when you let your subject speak for himself, then we don't hear what is behind him, right? What other people may think. We are letting I'm letting Ashoka define himself. And that is an issue in my time. I call it a portrait because it's really not a biography. Because we don't even know when he was born. and when he died. And if you do not know of a person when he was born, when he died, you can hardly write a biography, right? So it is a portrait as it emerged from his own writings. That's basically what I did. We can talk a little about the problems of my methodology, right? And that it has problems. Go ahead.
So I found that really interesting that it was your interest in um, the concept of dharma that ultimately led you to being curious about him, and that in the 4,000 odd words that he's left behind, he uses it. You said 100 times?
Over 100 times, yes. Over 100 times.
Is that right?
Yes.
Over 100 times. Did that change the way that you thought about the word, by the way?
Yes, because I think I may be exaggerating here, but I think that if Ashoka had not lived
Yeah.
and not preached his philosophy, his moral philosophy centered on Dharma, the history of Dharma may have been different in India because it was co-opted by the
Okay.
Buddhists, especially, and it may well have remained
Yes.
very much a Buddhist concept, while it was there, no doubt, but may have become more marginal within the Brahminical context. But the fact that it became so central, not just to Brahmanism and Buddhism and Jainism, but to the entire civilization of India, was probably due in large measure to Ashoka.
Thank you. Um, so my next question is how you research and write a book of this kind, what working with inscriptions and sources is like, and what sort of skills or training are important for someone who hopes to become a scholar of ancient India.
Yeah. So when we go back in time, 2000 odd years earlier, we have two kinds of sources for constructing history. Right? One is documents. Documents come in two kinds, inscriptions and manuscripts. Right? They're two very different, but still they are language. They're written. We can read them. Second are archaeological and art historical stuff, right? That is archaeologists find and present to us, right? An art historical material, such as the Ashokan pillars and the Ashokan capitals. They are all art historical. So there are the two things. For me, as I use the inscriptions, it is written in a language. And what is important, and I tell my students and everybody else, learn the language. Dr. Ramachandra Guha, when he first read my first draft of my book, he said, I have not said whose translation I am using for the inscriptions. But I told him, no, it's my own translation. He was a little surprised. You cannot use a translation to get at what somebody is speaking. Much, as we know, is lost in translation. The translator's lens is what we are using to understand what he said. So you had to know the language. And that is the most important part of researching ancient India. Unfortunately, many scholars, like many anthropologists working on modern stuff, don't speak or know the language of the subjects they're studying. Right? And that is an important part, I think. Yeah. So this is it's an insult to our subjects, not to know what they're saying, right? The least we can do to the subjects we study is to understand in their own voice what they're trying to say. And then reading text is not easy. It's not something that you can, it's not like picking up a local paper and reading something, right? A close reading of texts and inscriptions is significant. A close reading is different from knowing what it's saying, reading between the lines, learning, as I say often, from silencers. What is he not saying? As important as what he's actually saying, right? Or in the case of Ashoka, when I'm trying to paint a portrait of him, what is he hiding? Because when people try to present themselves in public, they're trying to present themselves in the best possible light, right? Secondly, reading widely good secondary literature about the period. One person cannot be a master of all areas of ancient India, right? So we need to read that. For me, reading 100 years of scholarship on Ashokan artifacts, on inscriptions and archaeology, that was, I think, for me, the training ground for actually writing something. And then, who were the contemporaries of Ashoka? Right? We know something about his father and grandfather, especially from Greek sources, because after Alexander's incursion, he left Greek kingdoms throughout what is today the Middle East. And Ashoka mentions them by name. He had connections to them, right? So reading about Alexander and what he did and Alexander's aftermath, that's important to understand what Ashoka was dealing with, especially at an international level, right? And then we could ask, how did Ashoka construct his pillars? There was no technology prior to Ashoka that would have permitted his engineers and craftsmen to produce those wonderful monolithic stone pillars. Where did he get the knowledge and the technology? It's still under debate. We still do not know. Yes, there are pillars in Persia, the Persian pillars, and some technology could have come from there. But all Persian pillars are structural pillars. They are part of a building. Ashoka's pillars are freestanding, right? So that's the questions that we have. So those are some of the things that go into writing, I think. Yeah.
I think that's such a helpful answer, and that really helped me because when I was reading your book, one of the things that I noticed was you try and point out when Ashoka is um, using wordplay, alliteration, or something like that to get a play on language to get emphasize something to persuade something. And when you talked about the fact that, how difficult it is to draw a biography of someone whose birth and death we don't know, one of the interesting things I think in your early chapter was how, you try and paint a picture of what's going on, in those Hellenistic, in those Greek kingdoms, and sort of say, well, what we might not know a lot of things about Ashoka, but here are some reasonable things that might have happened. That he grew up in a very cosmopolitan world. So thank you for that.
Yes,
So my
yes.
next question is one of the things that struck me throughout the book is how complicated Ashoka emerges as a figure, a conqueror, and an emperor, but also how deeply introspective, someone committed to moral governance, yet still operating within the realities of imperial power. You mention in the book that it is this complexity that makes him so fascinating. Why do you think Ashoka's complexity matters, both for understanding him historically and for understanding why he continues to resonate so strongly today?
Complexity doesn't matter on its own. Complexity matters if we are going to be accurate historically. All human beings are complex personalities. They have the good and the not so good, the beautiful and the ugly. Often biographies tend to go one way or the other. It tries to eliminate the complexity that is so inherent in human beings, and especially in human beings who have been elevated to a very high level of power and responsibility, right? I could give you one very clear example from the United States. Here they revere the founding fathers of America who wrote the Constitution, saying all men are created equal, right? They are beatified, sanctified as ideal human beings. Many, if not most of them, also own slaves. The complexity. How did the people who could say this here act this other way there, right? That's the
Exactly.
reality. So complexity is the reality rather than something I or anybody imposes on Ashoka. Ashoka emerges from his own writings as a complex person. Give one example. He defines what he means by dharma several times, and I give them those definitions, right? And definitions are especially how to foster good ethical, moral relationships with other people around you, right? Who are the people who are absent in these relationships? They are women. There are no women. The only woman there is the mother. Also in the compound, Mata Pita, the father and mother. In English, it will be parents. Right?
Yes.
So Ashoka has a blind spot with regard to women. Not, I think, because he didn't want women around, but I think it was part of the culture in which he was living that you get this blind spot that just like George Washington could be, or Jefferson could be wonderful Renaissance human beings, you know, the who would support the autonomy of the human being, but at the same time owned other human beings. So it's the blind spot there that you have in Ashoka. And I think what I was trying to do is to signal to the reader that this is a complex person. And what he says often shows that there are blind spots in his own vision of what Dharma is. For him, Dharma is central to living an ethical life. But it's all man-centered. The subject of Dharma is always a rather middle class, at least, man with a family, with slaves, with servants. So that's what he has in his own mind.
And I guess that also tells us something about the society in which he lives in.
Yes.
Very much.
Yes, exactly. Slavery was a common accepted phenomenon. Nobody questioned it. Ashoka didn't question it. What he did was to have proper relationships with your slaves. Today's word, we would say, treat them with kindness and respect, right? Don't
Yes.
abuse them. That's what he's saying. He didn't say, don't own them. So yeah, that's the society in which he grew up, and that shaped him. And even if you think of his but I tried to show at least as a possibility that there was a Greek influence in his upbringing, that the palace, the court in which he lived and grew up as a little boy was cosmopolitan. Right? But the Greeks had slaves also. So it was not just Indians. So the entire society there, Greek or Indian, slavery or Chinese, was all part of that time. So we can't blame him completely for that, but we have to recognize it. Yeah.
Thank you. My next question is, in several places in the book, you mention in several places that Ashoka leaves behind many riddles, puzzles, and at one point you write that sometimes Ashoka is infuriatingly brief. He stops when we want him to continue to tell us more. I was wondering what some of the most important or intriguing silences in the sources are for you, and why those gaps and ambiguities matter for understanding both Ashoka and the world he inhabited.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we should excuse Ashoka for not saying too much because he was limited by the medium on which he was writing, which was a stone, right? So you could not say a lot. If you had paper, he could have said more. However, even within that format, there are silences. He doesn't speak about his ancestors. Most kings of India or in Persia or anywhere else in the world always say so and so, the son of so and so, the grandson of so and so, the great king, etc. Right? You look at your ancestry to show how important you are. Persians always say that. Right? Ashoka, not a word. If you look at all his inscriptions, we would not know the name of his father or his grandfather. We know their names only thanks to the Greeks of the West. Right? So that's something. You can ask why. I have given some possible answers but it's something that future scholars may want to look at. I think even from a psychoanalytic, psychological perspective, right? To see why this man is so reticent to talk about his father, to give at least recognition. That's one, I think, that's given. And we don't know anything about his name, about his family. Once, in a very brief, what's called the Queen's Edict, he talks about his queen, gives a name, and who is the mother of one of his sons. That's the only time. And this is a bookkeeping thing. He says to his officials, if she gives a donation in the bookkeeping, put it under her name. In other words, not mine. It should come from her money, not from mine. Very, very banal kind of a thing that he said. He doesn't talk about his family. He talks about his sons and grandsons. So we know that they were there. But he never talks about who they were, what their names were. And it's the huge thing people working on India have been talking about. He does not talk about the caste system or the varnas, the four varnas. Not a word. Why? Did he not know about it? Was it not there? Was it purely a Brahminical invention that nobody really cared about? Very interesting and very intriguing. I've written about it elsewhere, but especially because in his Dharma preaching, he always talks about relationships across various divides. If the Varna was a central sociological category. You would say, how do people from one varna relate to others, right? That's something one could think about at least. He does not talk about the lands on his southern border. He talks a little bit about Keralaputra and etc., Tamraparni, Sri Lanka. He doesn't talk about any of the leaders of these people, kings or leaders. Whereas among the Greeks, he names all of them with really proper names. Why? Why does he give this courtesy to the Greeks to say these Greek kings, but not to the king of Sri Lanka? Not even the name. So that's an interesting thing that one may want to think about. And the other thing is he's supposed to be a Buddhist, and he should know Buddhist doctrine. Not one word about the central Buddhist and later Indian concepts of rebirth, karma theory, nothing. Why? So those are questions of silence that you get here. So the what would be called cultural institutions that we thought were so central for ancient India are missing in Ashoka's writing. So that's an interesting part, I think.
Thank you. My next question looks at a major theme running through the book is the distinction between Ashoka the Buddhist and Ashoka the king. You make the point that he was not simply a Buddhist ruler, but a ruler who happened to be Buddhist, and that his broader moral project of dharma extended beyond sectarian Buddhism. How should we think about Ashoka's Buddhism, and what do you think modern readers often misunderstand about the relationship between his personal faith and his political vision?
Yeah. What I've tried to at least indicate, I'm not sure whether I'm right, but at least a possibility that Ashoka had a chance to become a Buddhist ruler, to preach Buddhism, and to make it the state religion. But he didn't do it. In the first inscription that he wrote, which we call the Minor Rock Edict I, he clearly states that he's a Buddhist. And he takes a Buddhist viewpoint. Then silence. The word Buddhist does not occur a single time in his major inscriptions. If he only had those, we would not know that he was a Buddhist. The only time he uses anything similar, anything that refers to Buddhism, is the term Sangha, which refers to the Buddhist monks. Once, in passing, while he talks about all the other, what he calls pashandas, the groups, religious groups, Brahmins, Ajivakas, Jains, and Buddhist Sangha. Right? That's the only time he does. So, clearly, what I was trying to say is that possibly he was trying to produce some kind of a civil religion based on morality and dharma that all his subjects could adhere to, irrespective of what pashanda they belonged to, whether they were Jains or Buddhists or Brahmins. They all could rally around that. And I try to use the concept of civil religion with regard to that. So that's another one possibility. So he does not, in his writings, promote Buddhism, although we have two of his inscriptions that were sent to the Buddhist clergy that are completely Buddhist, that were probably not meant to be inscribed, but they were inscribed. So we have them. There he's completely Buddhist. He even mentions Buddhist scriptures that monks should read. So that's the other side of it. And then again, although he says nothing about Buddhism in his inscriptions, you look at his pillars, they're all in or related to Buddhism. They are in Sanchi, they are in Sarnath, they are in Lumbini. They're all immensely important Buddhist sites. And Professor Harry Falk has shown that all the pillars that you find across Bihar go from Pataliputra to Lumbini. It's almost like a pilgrim's route in which these are established. So they clearly have Buddhist significance. But he writes the pillar inscriptions, nothing about Buddhism. There's a symbolism of the pillars, but not actual words. So that's, I think, it's again the complexity we find of the person. And I think modern readers really, and even scholars, have seen Ashoka often through the lens provided by later Buddhist narratives about Ashoka. Ashoka becomes a hero figure for the Buddhists, right? Both the northern Buddhists and the southern Buddhists. There's the Ashoka Arama, Ashoka temple in China. So it's his fame is everywhere, right? As a Buddhist. But how much of it is later Buddhist hagiography and how much is it historical is the issue, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. That was so interesting. And one of the things that I found really interesting about about the book is you mentioned that when he's writing about religion, about influencing good behavior, it's not in the form of commands, but it's rather written to persuade. And I thought that was so interesting. And in the early part of the book, you mentioned how he's you know, perhaps the only ancient figure who said,
Yeah.
"I'm sorry." Um,
Yes.
and how that experiences of war and the trauma and the atrocities that came about with it perhaps had a significant influence um,
Yes.
for his approach to religion, um, to
Yes.
Buddhism.
Yes. I think that's very true. It was probably a trauma that he had. But to have a trauma in battle, you need a particular kind of conscience. A real ancient warrior would not be at all thinking about the carnage that he had. He would be exulting in that. He'd be reveling in that. Ashoka did not. Ashoka was heartbroken. So there was something there in him already that made him feel, oh my God, what have I done? That kind of feeling. So yeah, that's, I think, how did that come about? Um, I have some ideas about it, but one can never be sure, right? I think had probably some kind of Buddhist training in the beginning that gave him some ethical sensibilities that were not purely martial, the soldier in you. Um, and, Alexander would not have given a hoot for killing 100,000 people. He would have bragged about it.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's something there.
That's what makes him so interesting, I think. For my final question, I wanted to ask, with the current state of literature on Ashoka and ancient India more broadly, I was wondering what you think are some of the most pressing or exciting questions open for new scholars entering the field. And I know that you mentioned some, such as, what was his relationship with, his father and his family like. Um, and the last part of my question is, in writing and researching this book, were there particular historical, philosophical, methodological questions that your study of Ashoka led you to think deserve much more attention in the years ahead?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, the final book on Ashoka has still not been written. So there's a lot more work that can and should be done. I
Of
hope
course.
what I have done will be helpful as people you know, grapple with this historical figure. So that's one thing. And the one I already mentioned, the enormous significance of this period of about 5, 6 centuries between Ashoka and Chandragupta, the Gupta Empire, which is sort of seminal for the history, civilization of India. So that's an important area that had not been, I think, studied uh, as a as such a seminal period that and how it connects to the rest of Indian history, both political and religious history, as a history of ideas, right? That's one thing. So that's something that I think as we go forward, the centrality of archaeology for the study of this period will become more and more apparent. Athens and Rome have been excavated. They have been archaeologically examined for their history. The capital of Ashoka has not been. He built Pataliputra. During his time, Pataliputra, today's Patna, was the largest city in the whole world, largest by a factor of several times,
Mm.
2 or 3 times the size of Athens or Rome. But we still do not know the foundations there. What is lying beneath from the time of Ashoka or even Chandragupta? Because it lies buried beneath a modern city.
I think you
And
mentioned 6 to 8 meters or something.
yes, and we don't even know the full extent of it. So that's where I think, and for that, individual human beings can't do that. It has to be an organized effort at institutional level, right, to do
Mm.
that. I mean, governmental level. Modi or somebody has to say, we are going to do that kind of thing, right? And that's important. And I think so that's something a young scholar cannot do. But I think we need to understand better the complexity of the religious and social landscape of ancient India, especially the complexity in terms of chronology, which most historians look at, but especially geographically. We think of India as sort of one, Indian history as one. No, there are multiple Indian histories. What is happening in Bihar is not happening in Kashmir, and what is happening in Kashmir is not happening in Kerala. That complexity, I think, I'm glad to say people of my students' generation are doing a much better job than my generation did with regard to that. They are much more attuned to this complexity. And I think that is something people need to consider. When we talk about Ashokan history, we are talking about history of Bihar and maybe others over which Ashoka had influence, right? Not the whole of India, not the whole of it. So yes, there's a lot to be done. If I had one last word for people who work on ancient India, number one, language. Number two, language. Number three, language. That is something that is so frequently ignored. They go, unfortunately, more and more people, younger people especially, go into what they call theory. Yeah, theory is important, methodology is important, but those are tools. Those are tools. What are you going to do with them? For that, you need to read what is left behind by our forefathers. So that's what I want to leave behind.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining
Yeah.
us today.
Yes. You're welcome. I'm glad to
And
be with you.
we really appreciate your time. Wonderful.
Okay.
Um,
Bye-bye.
so we'll wrap this up then. And we
Yeah.
really appreciate your time with us.
Yeah. Thank you much.
Thank you very much.